Recently, a group of people from all over the globe converged in Canada to discuss their shared belief system that the Earth is not a sphere. To travel to the conference, some of them boarded airplanes, which, fortunately for them, are navigated in great circle routes, calculated using accurate maps of the Earth based on geodesic surveying data, and are guided by global positioning satellites orbiting the Earth. And, using technology developed by the process of science, they recorded the events and uploaded them to YouTube on the World Wide Web. The conference is called the Flat Earth International Conference, FEIC, but I prefer to call it the Mystery Pseudoscience Theater. So let's take a front row seat and hear what they have to say. I'll try not to interrupt.
And welcome to FE 2018 Canada, your Master of Ceremonies, Rick Hummer.
But what I can tell you is, I feel sorry for Neil deGrasse Tyson. I feel sorry for these guys that are locked into the programming, that are ignoring the science that's been tested and proven. It's not a ball.
Wait. Hold it right there. I guess I lied. I'm gonna have to interrupt. What science are we ignoring? Maybe he'll tell us. But to accept the flat Earth, you have to ignore all sorts of science. Even science that you can see for yourself, like lunar eclipses, objects getting hidden by the horizon, the two celestial poles appearing to rotate in opposite directions, the variation of star visibility throughout the seasons, and equinox, sunrise, and sunset, just to name a few. Flat Earthers have no valid testable explanations for any of that. And of course, mainstream science does, and it perfectly fits the heliocentric model. So let's see what we are ignoring.
The formula they gave you, 8 inches times the mileage squared, does not work. It's observable. Test it. Observe. Test it. Observe. Collect the data. I don't know about you guys, man. When I start adding up numbers, I get tired of adding up the same numbers that don't work for a formula that we've been given as a programming device that when you realize it's not round at all, it's flat.
Okay, here we go. How many times do I have to say it? They are using the wrong calculation for what they are trying to measure, and doing the tests wrong in other ways. The 8 inches per mile squared calculation does not calculate how much an object will be hidden behind the curve of the Earth. It is just a rough approximation of the drop from the horizontal. That is, if you drew a horizontal line out from where you are standing and measured down from that line to the surface at a given distance, that is what the calculation is giving you. That is not a number that tells you really anything important, and certainly doesn't tell you how much a distant object should be hidden behind the horizon. And not only is it measuring the wrong thing, but it has another glaring flaw, in that it ignores the viewer height. The higher you go, the farther away the horizon is, so you cannot use a calculation that ignores the viewer height when doing a line-of-sight test. For example, if you were doing a test across 10 miles of water, the 8 inches per mile squared calc ignores the viewer height and gives a result of 66 feet. 10 times 10 is 100. Times 8 inches is 800 inches, divided by 12 inches is 66.6 feet. But that does not mean that an object will be hidden by 66 feet. That is not what it measures. And if you are just 10 feet above the water, the correct calculation tells us that only 25 feet will be hidden by the curve. That's a big difference. And add to that other errors flat earthers make in these tests, such as disregarding refraction and getting the distance wrong, or even ignoring the height of the target. And it is clear that they are not doing it right. When you do it right, you always see what is expected: boats, buildings, and mountains hidden at the bottom by the horizon, by the correctly calculated amount. See metabunked.org/curve for the correct calculation. And flat earthers don't even have a valid explanation for why objects are hidden at the bottom in the first place.
Flat, water's a natural level, right? Is water a natural level?
Yes, water is a natural level. But what causes water to go level? Water cannot do anything on its own. It needs a force acting on it. And that force causing it to go level is gravity. And since everything we observe about gravity tells us it results from mass, and the Earth has trillions of tons of mass, it follows that the force of gravity is toward the center of the Earth, and therefore water is pulled toward the center of the Earth. And level, in this context, simply means that it is perpendicular to the direction of that force. So it is curved. I have asked countless flat earthers what force they think causes water to find its level. I have yet to get an answer. And if you don't think gravity can curve water, just look at the top of a waterfall. What do you think is causing that water to bend?
Okay. How many of you flew here? Anybody? Anybody fly here? Everybody drove? All right. Next time you're in a plane, look out. Try and see the curve. It's not there. But most importantly, do the tests.
No, sorry. Airplane altitudes are not high enough to see the curve of the horizon, except for high-altitude jets that fly much higher than a commercial airliner. And you need a wide angle of view. So that is a straw man argument. The Earth is really big, so even at airliner altitudes, you are still looking at a very small part of the Earth, and at a very shallow angle. The higher you go, the farther away the horizon gets, so your viewing angle to the horizon stays very low, and it's like trying to see the curve of a hula hoop held around your head at eye level. You're just not going to be able to see it. You have to get much higher to get a big enough down angle to see the curve. Many people, including Rob Skiba, have sent balloons high enough to see it. But of course, Skiba even ignored his own evidence, calling it inconclusive.
Because I can tell you in my own market, where I'm from South Bend, Indiana. And there's a guy there, we all heard it. What you're seeing here is a mirage. What you're seeing here is a mirage. Mirage. Okay. Got an idea. Let's go take a boat across the water and keep Chicago in sight the whole time. Sooner or later, that mirage is going to have to figure out where reality is, right? Tested and proven. It's not a mirage.
Wow, these guys are still confused about what a superior mirage is. You can tell by what he says that he thinks it is the kind of mirage like you see when you drive across the desert, and you see what looks like water on the road ahead, but as you approach, the water disappears. That is an inferior mirage, and it's a totally different thing that people are talking about when they're talking about the Chicago skyline. When the Chicago skyline can be viewed from about 60 miles across the lake, which is only in certain conditions, it is due to the light bending around the curve of the Earth due to the cold water. This is called refraction, and what you see when this happens is called a superior mirage. The newsman just said mirage, but it is clear from what he said that he meant superior mirage. So Hummer is confusing the two and making an equivocation fallacy. If you approach by boat, as he describes, and as Rob Skiba did in a video, there is no reason that the view of the building will disappear or will need to catch up. It will just emerge more and more from behind the curve, which is exactly what Skiba saw. And Skiba's video started from only 42 miles away, not 60. I wonder why. And there was no indication of an unusual refraction on that day. And from that distance, he sees only the top few hundred feet of the tallest buildings, exactly as predicted by the correct calculation. In fact, his video shows exactly what you expect from a curved Earth, the buildings becoming more and more visible from the top down as he approaches. Wow, these guys keep disproving themselves because they cannot understand the simple concept of refraction. They keep saying to do the tests, but they are doing them wrong and ignoring their own results. And you can easily test refraction yourself, like Greater Sapien did in a video, with just a laser beam and some ice. When he moves a bowl of ice under the laser beam, you can see the light is refracted down noticeably and measurably by the cold air. And that is just with a few inches of cold air coming from the ice. Over the lake, the cold air of water will continuously bend the light over the surface between the buildings and the viewer. and thus easily explains why it can sometimes be seen further than expected. Some people say that superior mirages must be upside down, but that is not true. Sometimes they are upside down, and sometimes they are right side up. It depends on the particular distances and the amount of cold air involved. For 2 days, various speakers encouraged their audience to keep fighting the good fight of their shared belief in the flat earth, and shared their bad arguments, bad experiments, and their pseudoscientific attempts at re-explaining obvious evidence for the spherical earth. On day 1, Mark Sargent, a former professional computer game player, took the stage and claimed to have figured out on his own, with no formal scientific training or background, that there are 5 questions related to the shape of the earth that scientists could not answer. What could possibly go wrong?
Some months ago, a German television team contacted me because they had heard about my science challenge and had found a physicist at Georgetown University I could debate. They also wanted to make it as easy on the scientist as possible, so their idea was simple. They would record me on video, reading 5 quick science-based questions, and then send that recording over to Georgetown, and he would respond in kind. This is what I read on camera. 1. Long-distance photography. The mainstream science formula for the curvature of the Earth is 8 inches per mile squared. An easy comparison would be the falling rate of 32 feet per second, so 8 inches per mile per mile. 2 miles is 2 times 2 equals 4 times 8 inches, or 32. 3 miles is 3 times 3 equals 9 times 8, or 72, and so on. At 50 miles, the curvature is 50 times 8, coming in at over 1,600 feet of curvature. And yet, with HD cameras, we can pull boats back into frame that are well beyond visual range.
As I explained in the last episode, the 8 inches per mile squared calculation is the wrong calculation to use to determine how much an object should be hidden by the horizon. The actual calculation for that is more complicated, but flat earthers cling to this one because it is easy to remember, easy to do, and, conveniently for them, it overstates how much should be hidden. And, again, it completely ignores the viewer height, which is critical. So when they make their observations using this calc, they are starting with the wrong assumptions, and therefore drawing the wrong conclusions. For example, here is a screenshot from a video Mark Sargent recently posted on his own channel, with a guy filming distant mountains in infrared that supposedly proves the Earth is flat. In this case, he can see Mount San Jacinto in Palm Springs from the cliffs above the beach in Malibu, California. He gives his viewing height of 150 feet above sea level, which they usually leave out entirely, and a distance to the mountain of 120 miles. I checked these numbers and they seem to be correct. But he doesn't bother to do the math, so let's check it for him. Plugging the numbers into the calculator at metabunk.org/curve, 120 miles distance, and a viewer height of 150 feet, we get the correct hidden amount of 7,351 feet. Okay, so how tall is the mountain? Well, oops, it's 10,833 feet tall. So that leaves 3,482 feet visible above the curve of the Earth. This observation is perfectly consistent with a curved Earth. But Sargent is actually making an additional claim in his speech. He is specifically talking about distant boats, which are, quote, beyond the visual range, and claims you can bring them back into view by zooming in. The problem here is, how does he know a boat he happens to see in the distance is supposed to be beyond the visible range? He would need to know the actual distance to the boat, so he is making further assumptions in these cases. He is assuming that a boat that is too far away to see without magnification is supposed to be further than the horizon, but that is not necessarily the case. When they try to show this, they show something like this. Now you see it, now you don't. But this has nothing to do with Earth's curvature. This is just perspective. There is no indication that this boat is behind the horizon. It was just far away, but you can easily see it is actually in front of the horizon. This boat is not partially hidden by the horizon, so they did not bring it back into frame over the curve. They just zoomed in on a distant boat that was too small to see without magnification. If there really were no curvature, then they could zoom in on ships that look like this one, that clearly is behind the horizon, and then see it like this one that is in front of the horizon. But they never show that because it does not and cannot happen. This is clearly caused by the curvature of the Earth, not by perspective. So, to the flat earthers that are watching, please provide video of a boat coming back into view from behind the curve, in which it was partially hidden at the bottom, and then is now brought back into full view to the waterline with a zoom. Or stop making this ridiculous claim. And while you're at it, do it with the sun.
All right. Stop right there, and I'll bring back the sun.
If it can work for boats, you should be able to zoom in on the sun or the moon after they set and bring them back into view. But of course, that never happens either, because the Earth is curved.
Not only does the new technology clearly show that it's not a mirage, but the same objects can be viewed in infrared and can be targeted ship to ship by beam radar. Can science explain this? They had no answer.
Yes, only in certain circumstances do superior mirages come into play. In the San Jacinto case, for example, I showed how it works without any refraction at all. And even if there is refraction, infrared light is still light, and it still refracts. Use of infrared in this case just allowed the photographer to cut through the atmosphere better and see the distant mountains better than he could using visible light. And radar waves are high-frequency radio waves, and it is well known that radar waves can bounce off the ionosphere, giving them a much farther range than line of sight can, reaching far beyond the horizon. So yes, science can explain all of this.
Number 2, vacuum versus gravity. The force of a vacuum is measured in units of torr, T-O-R-R. Even a low-level vacuum can overcome gravity here on the surface. In building molecule-free chambers for the manufacturing of electronics, a series of massive pumps are needed to create a 99% vacuum. That's -9 torr. And for the remaining 1%, horsepower isn't enough. It can only be achieved by a chemical leaching process. That being said, how is the -10 torr vacuum force of space not ripping off the atmosphere of this world?
Okay, so here is another huge misconception. Vacuums don't really suck. You have only experienced vacuums inside Earth's atmosphere. When a vacuum is opened here on Earth, it is the pressure of the atmosphere that forces the air in to fill the void. We call it sucking because that is what it seems like, but it is really pushing. The pressure of the atmosphere is caused by gravity. It is just the weight of the air above pushing down on the air below. As you go higher, there is less and less air above, so the pressure gets less and less, until there just is no more air. There is no reason that the emptiness of space would suck this air away. It is just held to the Earth by gravity. And by the way, there is no such thing as negative torr. A perfect vacuum would be 0 torr. The vacuum of interstellar space is not a perfect vacuum, but very close to 0 torr. This is what happens when you don't know science. If you are going to try to debunk science, at least try to understand it.
What is gravity? Oh, we're going to do both. Sorry about that. And remember that there are gases that already defy it, like helium, hydrogen, and fluorocarbons.
Really? He doesn't know what gravity is? Gravity is the universal observation that all objects with mass pull on all other objects with mass. with a strength relative to the amount of mass of the objects and the distance. This is observed, measured, tested, and predicted in countless ways. And no, helium and other gases do not defy gravity, not in the way he means. Nothing with mass defies gravity. But, like all forces, gravity can be counteracted by an opposite force. In the case of light gases, they counteract gravity because of the buoyant force. Think of a helium balloon. Gravity pulls on it, but it also pulls on the denser air around it. But since the air around it is more dense, that is, there is more matter in the same amount of space, then gravity pulls a little bit stronger on the air around the balloon. So this forces the balloon up, as the denser air squeezes down around it, like squeezing a toothpaste tube. Buoyancy is a direct result of gravity, not a defiance of gravity. I wonder why Sargent thinks helium balloons go up. Magic?
Isn't it more logical to suggest that the atmosphere is being contained in an enclosed, pressurized system? They had no answer.
No, it's not, for the reasons I just gave. You don't need an enclosure. Gravity holds the atmosphere to the Earth, and there is no reason that the vacuum of space would suck it away. The fact that atmospheric pressure decreases with altitude is direct evidence of that. And of course, they have no direct evidence of their imagined snow globe dome.
Number 3, eclipse shadow. Mainstream science tells us that the moon is over 2,000 miles wide, and yet during the 2017 American eclipse, no offense, the moon's shadow was only 70 miles wide, a reduction of over 97%. This is what the equivalent of having a 6-foot man walking in front of a wall where his shadow is smaller than an action figure at only 2 inches. Where do we see this in our everyday lives? We've seen a shadow's actual size and some much larger. Where can we see small shadows? The flat earth community says that the moon is less than 50 miles wide, much closer and the same size as the sun. Isn't this explanation also possible? They had no answer.
This is so easy and obvious. The sun is about 400 times bigger in diameter than the moon. So the moon's shadow forms a cone shape and is much smaller than the moon when it gets to the Earth. Is the explanation of them both being close, small, and the same size also possible? No, for many reasons. For one thing, if the moon were as close as they think it is, then people in different parts of the world would be looking at its features at vastly different angles. So there would be no way for us all to see the same side of the moon and the same phase of the moon from all vantage points on Earth, but that is what we see. The moon must be far away for this to work, and we know its distance by many other ways. Today, we can even measure it directly with radar and lasers.
Number 4, moon temperature. Science has yet to address this relatively new discovery that the moon generates a cold light. We all know that in the daytime it is 90 degrees in the sunlight, 80 degrees in the shade, depending on conditions. I know I'm not going to do the Celsius conversion up here, sorry. However, at night, especially when the moon is high in the sky, we see the opposite. While it might be 50 degrees in the moonlight, it's warmer at 60 degrees in the moon's shade, sometimes showing temperature shifts of over 13 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, under controlled experiment conditions, magnified moonlight is even colder still. Again, the opposite of sunlight. We can generate this with technology today using a cold laser. The question is, why is the moon giving off a cold laser light? They had no answer.
The cold moonlight argument always struck me as funny. Flat earthers flat out reject over 500 years of astronomy, and about 70 years of extremely well-documented space travel, and tons of other evidence they can verify themselves. And yet, they absolutely accept the results of a few ignorant people doing a flawed experiment with thermometers in their driveway. Their confirmation bias knows no bounds. In these experiments, the temperature of objects exposed to the moonlight is compared to those in the shade, and those in the shade are slightly warmer, leading the experimenters to the wrong conclusion that the moonlight is cold. What is really happening in these experiments is explained by radiative cooling. Objects that are warmer than the atmosphere will gradually lose their heat to the atmosphere at night. By putting an object under a shade, you are actually slowing down that heat radiation to the atmosphere. So those objects will stay a little warmer longer than objects exposed to the full atmosphere. It has nothing to do with the moonlight. Except for the cold lasers he mentioned, which are a special case I will explain in a moment, light cannot cause cooling. It would break the laws of thermodynamics. Cooling occurs when heat is conducted, convected, or radiated away to another medium. There is nothing that light can do to speed up that process and make things cool faster. In fact, most light will cause the opposite, more heating. And cold lasers only work by pointing laser beams at a specific wavelength from 6 different directions at once to slow down the movement of individual molecules of a substance. Cold lasers are used to make only very small quantities of matter very cold, down to microkelvins, for the purpose of studying quantum behavior and to make atomic clocks more accurate and other possible applications. Since you need 6 lasers in 6 directions to do this, the moonlight cannot possibly be anything like a cooling laser. And additionally, flat earthers never explain how the lighted part of the moon just happens to move around the moon's surface every month, always pointing directly towards the sun, and how there can be shadows in the craters if the light is coming from the moon itself rather than from the sun as an outside source. This argument is just absurd in multiple ways.
Last but not least, the Van Allen belts. A simple yes or no question. Are the Van Allen radiation belts deadly? If yes, then how did Apollo 11 through 17 make round trips through these belts with only aluminum and plastic as shielding? No one died, no one got radiation poisoning, nobody even got cancer. I think there's still like 5 left. Radiation is only stopped by 2 metals, lead and gold. Both are very heavy and cannot be used in aerospace because of their weight. If the answer is no, the belts are not deadly, then explain the video currently on the NASA.gov website called Orion Trial by Fire, in which NASA clearly states that the belts are so dangerous they will not be testing manned capsules because they are unable to solve the radiation problem. Keep in mind, this is not an old video. It was created at the end of 2014.
Well, yes and no. The Van Allen belts could be deadly, but there are things that they can do to protect the astronauts and the equipment. In the case of the Apollo missions, they did use shielding, and they chose a path to avoid the strongest part of the radiation belts, and they traveled through the radiation very quickly to minimize exposure. They knew it was a risk, but one they were willing to take. Sargent is not correct that only lead and gold can protect against radiation. That is only true of X-rays. But the Van Allen belts are not X-rays. They are charged particles called ionizing radiation, for which aluminum, other light metals, and even the epoxy resin heat shield provided significant shielding. Despite these efforts, unfortunately, recent studies on the 24 astronauts that went to the moon do show that they have had increased incidence of cardiovascular diseases, which was possibly caused by the radiation exposure, not just from the Van Allen belts, but also from galactic cosmic rays and solar radiation beyond the belts. As you would expect, NASA wants to improve the protection of the astronauts in the new Orion spacecraft. And it makes perfect sense that they would test the craft with sensors before sending up humans. They certainly did not say anything like they are unable to solve the radiation problem, as Sargent claims. Let's hear what they actually said about it in that video he misquotes.
Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
It says a lot about the strength of your arguments when you have to mischaracterize your opposition so dishonestly. The strange thing about the flat earthers arguing about the Van Allen belts is that it was a NASA-associated scientist, James Van Allen, who first discovered them and warned of their danger. Why would they do that if the whole enterprise of going to space is a hoax, as flat earthers claim? Their argument just doesn't make any sense in light of what they believe. And as usual, Sargent got many of the facts involved completely wrong. I don't know if Sargent's story about the Georgetown scientist is true, but it is interesting that he doesn't name the scientist. I am not a professional scientist, but I was able to answer all of these questions with just a fundamental knowledge of science and a bit of research, which apparently Sargent doesn't do. He prefers to pretend he has discovered problems with the heliocentric globe model that science cannot answer. The most frustrating thing is that these flat earthers have been given answers to all their questions many times by knowledgeable people, and yet somehow their belief system seems to be immune to the facts. It is perfectly good to ask questions. That is what science is all about. But it is not okay to ignore the reasoned, tested, scientific answers. You will notice that flat earthers really only have one argument for their flat earth belief. It looks flat. That's it. That's all they have. They do not actually have a working flat earth model that explains any real observations, passes any tests, or makes any accurate predictions. They don't even have a working map. So instead of actually trying to prove their belief, they usually resort to trying to poke holes in the scientific evidence for the spherical Earth and the heliocentric model, as you're about to see. At the recent conference, a group of flat earthers that call themselves the Globe Busters tried to bust many scientific facts. In this episode, I will cover their claims about the moon. Will their claims hold up to scrutiny, or will it just be more lunacy?
Some of the incongruencies that we have, additional incongruencies, I should say, with the heliocentric model, would be, first up would be the moon, okay? We're told in the heliocentric model that the moon is basically reflecting the light from the sun, and it goes through different phases, depending on what angle it is to the sun. That's how we get our different phases throughout the month. But the one thing that I want to focus on primarily is what happens on a full moon. Now, we've all seen a full moon. We've seen the harvest moon. We've seen it gigantic. We've seen it all different sides. We've seen many photographs of it. And when the moon is full, it is absolutely brilliantly bright, and it is lit evenly, pretty much evenly from the center to the edges. And in fact, really, the edges seem to be a little bit brighter. For the most part, at least in most of the moon photography that I've done. But what you really need to do is you need to think about that for a minute. It's like if you were to take a flashlight and you were to point it at a basketball or any type of a ball, what would you see? Well, what you would see is you would see at the front of the ball, the sphere, something like we're showing right here, you would see a hot spot, okay? The very brightest part would be right in the center. And beyond that, you would see a diminishing light going back towards the equatorial region, okay? We never see that with the moon, and that is a huge incongruency. The lighting of the moon simply cannot be caused by reflecting sunlight. It just makes absolutely no sense. There is no law of physics that explains that, and that is a huge incongruency.
So Bob Nodal wants us to point a flashlight at a basketball to test what the sunlit full moon should look like. But he doesn't show us a basketball, he shows us this 3D rendering of a smooth, shiny ball. So let's look at a basketball in bright, direct lighting. It is a bit brighter in the center and darker toward the edges, but much less so than his digital ball. Basketballs have somewhat shiny surfaces, so they do show some variation in the lighting across the surface, and even a bit of a hot spot, depending on the ball's surface and the lighting. But the surface of the moon is not like the surface of a basketball. There is more to consider than just the shape of an object reflecting the light when determining what it will look like. We have to look at two other things: its smoothness, and its reflectivity. A very smooth surface, as seen on these billiard balls, reflects light at steep angles back to the source of light, resulting in a bright hot spot, and it gets darker toward the edges. This is called specular reflection. More commonly, we would just call it shiny. And in case you're not sure what that is, here are two other examples of dense objects exhibiting some shiny specular reflection. But rougher surfaces reflect light differently, as they tend to scatter the light in all directions, like these unpolished stone balls. This is called diffuse reflection. You can see there is no hot spot and almost no darkening toward the edges. This is more like the moon. It is not smooth and shiny. The moon is covered by a powdery dirt called regolith, which reflects the light very diffusely. In fact, the moon's regolith is so diffusely reflecting, it is described as Lambertian, which means you see very close to the same amount of light no matter at what angle you view the surface. So this explains why you don't see variation in brightness from the center to the edges, and the moon appears as if it were a flat disk. And additionally, the moon has very low reflectivity. The moon is actually quite dark in color. An object's color and texture affects its albedo, which is a measure of how much light it reflects. The albedo of the moon is actually quite low. It is only 0.12, meaning that it only reflects about 12% of the light that it receives. This is about the same albedo as old asphalt or dark wet soil. In contrast, the Earth averages an albedo of 0.37, which is about 3 times brighter. With such a low albedo, any subtle variation in light reflectivity of the moon due to the varying viewing angle between the center and the edges becomes even harder to see. So once again, flat earthers fail because they are willfully ignorant of science, leading them to have incorrect expectations. And as you're about to see, their flat earth belief is so poorly defined, and it is so useless for explaining any observations, that they cannot even agree with each other about the most basic facts.
I would still argue, not to be like a devil's advocate, but I would argue that moonlight being reflected sunlight may actually be the case. I mean, it's not incompatible with the notion of a flat Earth, but I mean, it does bring up a good point. Although, in reflected light, there could be some of that energy absorbed by the moon and other, frequencies of that energy reflected. But just wanted to mention that because that is a point of contention for a lot of people, or at least when people say that, the moonlight couldn't possibly, and this goes all the way back to Zetetic from the 1860s. Even Robotham argued that moonlight couldn't possibly be reflected sunlight because, it's a cooling light, it has putrefying effects as opposed to, moonlight has putrefying effects where sunlight has preservative effects. So there are different properties between sunlight and moonlight, but I think it is a bit of a leap to say that therefore, moonlight couldn't possibly be reflected sunlight because to me at least, there is a lot of evidence that the moon's phases are somehow correlated to its relationship position to the sun. But
yeah,
my 2 cents.
Yeah, and you'll find that, obviously, straight up, I disagree with that, but that's okay and you'll find that there's a lot of thought and conjecture about, the nature of things and amongst flat earthers. And that's, mostly because we don't have a $52 million a day budget to go and research on this. So what we're presenting to you today, at least in our opinions, is common sense. And in my mind, common sense tells me that if I shine a light on a ball, it's going to have a hot spot and it's going to diminish back towards the back. Now, a lot of other flat earthers have said that the moon is a self-lighting source. And if you want to look at that biblically, God created the 2 great lights in the sky. He doesn't say anything about the moon reflecting the sunlight or anything like that. They're supposedly their own individual lights. So there's obviously several different perspectives on it, and that's why you will not always get 2 flat earthers agreeing on the same model.
I love to listen to 2 flat earthers argue about who is more wrong. John the Morgile, and this is the first time I've ever said this about him, is right that the moon reflects sunlight. Of course it does. Reflected light of the sun perfectly explains all moon observations, particularly the phases, and the idea of the moon generating its own light is patently absurd. There is no mechanism that could possibly cause the moon to self-generate the phases in sync with the sun's position, while leaving shadows in the craters. But he's also wrong when he says it is not incompatible with the flat Earth. Of course it is. There is no possible positioning of the sun, moon, and an observer that could even result in a full moon on a flat Earth. Think about it. A full moon requires viewing the moon from very nearly the direction of the sun, but that is impossible on a flat Earth. If the moon were only a few thousand miles above the surface, and only a few thousand miles away, as they claim, then you would never view it at an angle that is close enough to the light source for it to look full. And that angle would drastically change throughout the night as the moon moves over your head. And furthermore, if you could see a full moon in the northern hemisphere on a flat Earth, then the moon would be close to a new moon phase at the same time when viewed from the southern hemisphere on the other side of the flat Earth, since you would be looking at it from the other side. But of course, we never see that. The moon is seen in the same phase in all locations on the Earth in the same day. So they both are demonstrably wrong in different ways. In fact, observations of the moon are devastating to the idea of a flat Earth, as I've explained before, which is why they desperately try to refute it. And anyone can make these observations.
Okay, so next thing up that I want to talk about is eclipses, I think, are a problem. Now, one of the biggest arguments that we get from globe believers is, how do eclipses work on a flat Earth? Well, there are several schools of thought on that, but I think what we want to start out with first is looking at why the heliocentric eclipse model is unrealistic, okay? And if you look at this diagram here, basically what it's showing is it's showing the sunlight coming in at straight lines, to the moon, but yet the shadow is focused down to a very small point, okay? Now, last year, I think it was August of last year, we had the solar eclipse. Myself and my family, we all went to Nebraska to see the sun eclipse in its totality. And one of the interesting things that they told us that was predicted and verified by us with our balloon that we launched was that the umbra would be about 70 miles. And if you don't know what the umbra is, that's the part of essentially totality, the very darkest part. Then there's supposed to be what's called a penumbra, which is kind of a twilight zone. But we never really actually witnessed a penumbra. We saw a shadow, an umbra, and then back to daylight.
Okay, Nodal shows he doesn't understand why the shadow of the moon during a solar eclipse is smaller than the moon. He doesn't even understand the illustration he is using. This is because he leaves out a critical fact: the size of the light source. The sun is about 400 times bigger than the moon. So let me illustrate why that results in a small shadow. The sunlight is not just a single beam of light going in one direction like a laser beam. You have to realize that every part of the sun generates light that beams out in every direction. So picture each spot on the sun sweeping out a wide swath of light, not just a single beam toward the moon and Earth. During a lunar eclipse, the light from each part of the sun is blocked by the moon at a slightly different angle, as illustrated in this animation, which of course is not to scale but illustrates the concept. You can see that because of the different angles of the light coming from different parts of the sun, the net result is a cone-shaped shadow, the umbra, between the moon and the Earth, in which none of the sunlight can directly get to. And this also explains why there is a penumbra, which is a region which is blocked from some of the direct sunlight, but not all of it. By the way, I watched last year's solar eclipse in person also, and I definitely experienced the penumbra. From the time the moon starts to partially block the sun, from our perspective, you are in the penumbra. And the sky gradually gets darker during that time as the umbra gets closer and more of the sun is blocked. I really don't know what Nodal was expecting to see, but it was obvious to me and the other people around me.
But the interesting thing about that is if the moon is only casting a 70-mile wide shadow on the Earth, then logical thought would make you wonder, well, if you turn that around and we're looking at a lunar eclipse where the Earth is supposedly blocking the sunlight from the moon, then you would expect to see something on the order of about 4 times that size. It's a little bit less than that, of a shadow on the moon.
Wow, no, that is not how it works. You cannot just multiply the moon's shadow by 4 to get to the size of the Earth's shadow. That is a gross oversimplification. Yes, it's true that the Earth is about 4 times bigger than the moon, and the distances involved, of course, are about the same in solar and lunar eclipses. But the angles are different. The relative sizes of the Sun and Earth, and the relative sizes of the Sun and Moon are very different. So the angles of the sunlight are very different. His so-called common sense analysis ignores the angular differences. The Earth's shadow, when it reaches the moon in a lunar eclipse, is exactly as predicted by the distances, sizes, and angles involved. This unique composite image of a recent lunar eclipse shows the size of the whole shadow relative to the moon. Sorry, Nodal, but your common sense is not good enough for science. You have to look with better eyes than that, understand the geometry, and sometimes you have to do the math.
The Globers will tell you, well, the mathematics all works out for it, but they're basing that math on these type of angles, which are absolutely unrealistic. This is not how shadows are cast.
Astoundingly, Nodal admits that the math works out, but he prefers to go with his flawed intuition instead. I have rarely seen a more blatant admission from a flat earther that they are not doing science, but rather they are trying to support a belief system by attacking science. Yes, the math works out when you understand it and you get the distances, sizes, and angles correct.
In fact, most of the time, we all see if you have a light source and we're casting a shadow, I'm seeing my shadow now, the shadow is typically bigger than the object that's casting it.
Again, when the light source is bigger than the object, the shadow can be smaller than the object. They just have never tried it. But I did, and it's easy to do. I used this photography light and a small plate. You can see I drew the outline of the plate on this paper, and as I moved the plate away, the dark part of the shadow, the umbra, is definitely smaller than the plate. You can easily try this yourself. You just need a light bigger than the object casting the shadow. So again, this explains why the moon's shadow during a solar eclipse is smaller than the moon.
But there's been a few times where during solar eclipses, the shadow of the moon on the Earth was less than 2 miles in diameter, which really begs the question, how is an object that's supposedly, 1,000 miles, they say, in diameter, or radius or whatever, for the moon, how is it possible for an object that large to cast a shadow that's only 2 or even 50 or 70 miles in diameter?
Yes, this is true. The size of the moon's shadow does vary a lot in different eclipses, because the moon's orbit is not circular, but elliptical. So the varying distances result in varying shadow sizes. In fact, when a solar eclipse occurs when the moon is near its farthest distance from the Earth, called apogee, the umbra does not even reach the Earth, and therefore we see an annular eclipse instead of a total eclipse, in which the moon does not entirely block our view of the sun. Again, when you include all the facts, it works. And let's not forget, they have no explanation for any of this.
I took this quote directly from Wikipedia. And of course, like you said, the Selenilian, God, that's hard to say for me, eclipses occur when both the sun and the moon are above the horizon in the sky. They're rare, but they absolutely do happen. So the mainstream explanation from Wikipedia tells us that they say, although the moon is in Earth's umbra, both the sun and eclipsed moon can be simultaneously seen because atmospheric refraction causes each body to appear higher in the sky than their true geometric positions. And to that I say, BS alert, BS alert. That is absolutely preposterous. That there is no way that you would get that type of refraction, especially looking up, up in the sky. There's just nothing about that makes any sense. And again, you have to research a little bit into atmospheric refraction to understand why that is absolutely impossible.
Whenever flat earthers bring up the Selenilian eclipse, in which both the sun and moon can be seen at the same time above the horizon during the eclipse, they always leave out a critical fact. Are you starting to notice a pattern here? They leave out that it only occurs for about 2 to 9 minutes before the sun or moon sets, and only if you are viewing from just the right location. Indeed, it is caused by atmospheric refraction. Both the sun and moon are just above the horizon when this occurs, so the light is traveling through the atmosphere at a very low angle, which is well known to frequently cause refraction effects. Nodal says it cannot happen when looking up at the moon. But you wouldn't be looking up. You would be looking just above the horizon, and the refraction allows both the sun and moon to momentarily be visible at the same time. Okay, there is more of this, but I think I've covered enough for one video. The most astounding thing to me is that this team of globebusters freely admit that they do not have a working model that explains any moon observations. And yet they are sure the heliocentric globe model is false. No, there is only one way to debunk science, and that is with better science. I think I have conclusively shown that that is not what they are doing. Thanks for watching.